Welcome to our Adams Speaker Series. I'm Kurt Graham. I'm the president of the Adams Presidential Center, and it's just a great privilege and pleasure to have you all here. Grateful to be here and have such a great crowd. We had about more than 200 RSVPs for the live event here, and we have another, at least 150 or so, I think, online. So we've got a pretty good crowd joining us tonight for what we hope will be a very great program. I'll introduce our distinguished panel here in just a moment, but I wanted to express a few thank yous as we get going. I first and foremost, of course, want to thank Quincy Public Schools for their support. The Quincy High School events and IT team have been instrumental in making this auditorium come to life for us. And student volunteers from both Quincy High and Quincy North High, or North Quincy High, sorry, are here as ushers and also going to help with the Q&A section a little bit later in the program. So we appreciate them very much being here and participating with us. We also want to give a shout out to our friends at the Adams National Park. That's Marianne Peaks and her team. They brought some artifacts over from Abigail and Louisa Catherine. Hopefully you got to see some of those on the way in. Very thoughtful and added a lot to tonight's program. We also are excited about a partnership with a new business in town, a new bookstore over on Hancock, Next Chapter Bookstore. And if you didn't buy a signed copy of the book that we're discussing tonight on the way in, you can certainly buy it on the way out. And we appreciate having them here with us and adding that dimension to our program. I want to recognize some of our distinguished guests. Mayor Koch is here with his wife. We appreciate all that he does to support all things Adams. We have some of our board members here with us. General Dunford, I believe, is on his way.
Yeah, he'll probably get here.
He'll get here. Anyway, Joe Dunford and his wife Ellen is here. Joe is the chairman of our board and a very busy man, and we appreciate that he's going to be here with us tonight. We have a couple of other board members, Ed Cohane and his wife, Rob Waldron and his family as well. I hope I'm not missing anybody else. We might have a couple of other board members tuning in from afar, but we appreciate all of that. Just a housekeeping note, as we get the program going, you maybe were given a card or a pen or a pencil on the way in. If you have a question for our panel, feel free to write that down. And we have, as I mentioned, volunteers who will be going up and down the aisles periodically and hand that in, and they'll get those to me, and we'll get as many of your questions to our panel as we can. Should be a very interesting time. And I also want to, before I forget, I'm supposed to do this at the end, but if I don't do it now, I know it won't happen. On March 8th, in this very auditorium, from 2 to 5 in the afternoon, is the local Quincy version of Remember the Ladies, which tonight, remember the First Ladies, Remember the Ladies coming right up, where 5 Quincy women will be honored for their contributions to the community. And this event will be emceed, hosted by our own Danielle Allen, a member of the Adams Presidential Center Board, professor at Harvard, a very distinguished, lovely and entertaining woman in her own right, and she will be here to host that event. So mark your calendars and be here on March 8th in the afternoon, 2 to 5, as the guests of Mayor Koch and his wife to honor these women for their contribution to our community. So before I bring out the panel, I just want to say, it's a great privilege to be here at the Adams Presidential Center. I get to be up here in the front, and it maybe looks like I do a lot of things and make all this stuff happen. There is one reason why a lot of things get done at the Adams Presidential Center, and why programs like this come off so seamlessly. And her name is Kathy O'Brien. And I greatly appreciate all that she does, continues to do. I also wanted to mention a couple of part-time staff that we have, Kathy Folan and Sabrina Adorno, who you may have met on the way in, but they're also here tonight helping with the logistics. So with that, let me bring out our panel, and we'll get right into this evening's program. First, I'd like to introduce Nancy Keegan-Smith, who is the retired director of the Presidential Materials Division at the National Archives and Records Administration. Nancy? By the way, all 3 of tonight's panelists are founding members of the First Ladies Association for Research and Education. So they've done probably as much as any trio you're ever going to meet to promote the role and the understanding and the scholarship related to First Ladies. Next, I'd like to bring out Diana Carlin. Diana is a professor emerita of communications at St. Louis University. She also taught, and I believe still teaches from time to time, at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. She teaches classes on the First Lady, and again, is a founding member of FLAIR. And finally, last but certainly not least, Anita McBride. Anita is the director of the First Ladies Initiative at American University School of Public Affairs. She is the former chief of staff to First Lady Laura Bush, and again at American University runs a center dedicated to a deeper understanding of the First Ladies. So join me in welcoming our distinguished panel.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you.
This is a great opportunity for us to have you here, and this is a great topic and something that we feel very strongly about here in Quincy. We feel like this community produced two of the finest First Ladies that we've had, so
Exactly.
we think like this is an important place to start. Let me start with kind of how you got into this business, how you got into doing this. And I have kind of a two-part question here and I'll let you each have a shot at this. There's all kinds of books that have been written, different biographies of some of the First Ladies. We have memoirs from many of them. They show up in chapters at different times. So there's a lot of information out there on First Ladies. So what was it that possessed you to write this book, which our audience is going to buy on the way out? I'm really happy to have. And by the way, all the copies out there are signed, if I didn't mention. So, they go up in value over time. So I'm curious as to why you wanted to write this book. And then I'm just curious about why you three wanted to write this book. And there's an interesting, to me, you're a very fascinating team, and I want to tell you. Historians usually work alone. It's very rare to see a co-authored book like this. I mean, there are anthologies where people contribute a chapter, but in terms of sitting down and writing a product together. So in Nancy, we have a career archivist. In Diana, we have a university professor, scholar there. And in Anita, we have an accomplished administrator and executive who was very close to this role, obviously, in her work. So the three of you come from completely different walks of life. And I'm just curious as to, who had the idea? Who made the call? How did that come together?
How did it happen?
Diana.
Well, as you said, I have taught courses on First Ladies for over 30 years at multiple universities now, and I never had a textbook. I had to cobble everything together, and about 4.5 years ago, I got an email from a publisher who I dealt with earlier, wanted to know if I wanted to pitch a book idea. And I had pitched this to them, something on First Ladies, because there are more courses and units of courses being taught, and everybody's frustrated because there wasn't a textbook. So I suggested it. They loved the idea, and they came back and said, we want to offer you a contract. I said, well, there's one condition. It would take me 10 years to do what I want to do by myself, and so I need a couple co-authors, and I explained who Nancy and Anita were, and they said, yeah, they're really qualified to do that. Yes, they are. So they came along for the ride, and we started with a textbook. And it came out a year and a half ago in August of 2023.
Right.
And then the editor was so enthralled and said, why didn't we learn any of this? In fact, that's a common response we get, is why didn't we learn this in school about these women? And so she said, when you finish this, would you be willing to do a second version of the book for the public? And that is Remember the First Ladies. So 2 books, 2 different colors, 2 different titles. And the great thing about it was once we took all the pedagogical things out, we had about 50 or 60 extra pages that we could write, so we were able to really fill in a lot of things. But that's really how it happened. It started as a textbook. And this has just been wildly successful because I think people are hungry to learn about these women.
Yeah, it definitely fills a void.
And you talked about being unusual for 3 of us. I've done a lot of co-authored books. Nancy and I have co-authored book chapters together. Anita's done co-authoring. But 3 of us hadn't worked together. And the publisher was a little nervous.
Yeah.
The most they'd ever had were 2 authors, and they said often before the book was finished, they were not talking to one another. And obviously we still are. So they kind of marveled at how well we worked together, but we knew each other's strengths, and so we divided work up, but we also, everybody had their fingers on every single chapter in the book.
Right.
And we were willing to, we're such good friends, that we were willing to sort of, be honest with one another to make it a better book.
That's great.
And amazingly, our various husbands would say, did you write this chapter? Did Anita write this chapter? Did Diana? The way we wrote, although the 2 of them definitely say I'm more flowery than they are, but except for the flowery part, our voice and the points we want to make were right on. And it is hard in the book to tell who has written what part of the book.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. That's a very that's a strength. I mean, that's very unique to be able to write with a unified voice. Anita, let's talk for just a second about the role of the First Lady in the sense that it's not constitutional.
Right.
It's largely ceremonial, something obviously we're going to get into that evolved. So what do you say to critics who say, well, the First Ladies, I mean, they're really just an appendage, to the executive. I mean, it's really not what is it about the role that merits study?
Well, what an extraordinary platform, right? To not have any statutory authority. You get to pick and choose what you want to do. Each person that comes in to this position gets to redefine that position. And when the president is sworn in, and that 35-word oath, and there's not one word about the First Lady, but it's an automatic, powerful platform for them. And I think the important point to make to your question, Kurt, is how could, we talk a lot about inclusive history in our country. How could we not include the stories of these women from our founding, what they endured, what they sacrificed, how they contributed to the life of the nation. And so this book, and I just want to make one comment about what Diana and Nancy said, what a privilege it was for me to be part of this team. I was very daunted by the prospect of writing a book and could not have done it alone. They were much more skilled and experienced. I had the opportunity to work with 3 First Ladies and 3 administrations. I saw the position up close and personal, had a front row seat to history. But to put all of this together in a book that's really done this well, we are so thrilled. This is a year since this book has come out, and we've together done over 100 and something events, and communities like Quincy. This is pretty special to be here, I have to say. I feel the weight of having Louisa and Abigail looking over my shoulder here right now, but I think, yes, it is a partly ceremonial role, and that's not to be diminished. That soft power is so important, and George Washington knew that from the beginning. His was a 2-person role in this new nation, a new form of leadership, and he knew he needed a partner in the ceremonial, the head of state role, and that is a thread of continuity for every single person who has been First Lady.
That's great. Talk a little bit about, and you can take this in whatever order you want, but when you think about the origins of the role, because as we said, it's not statutory, it's not in the Constitution. It sort of gets invented, and it gets invented by some of the early, by Martha, by Abigail, by Dolly. Obviously, Jefferson's wife had died before he became president, so there was no First Lady for that third president. But talk a little bit about some of the precedents, some of the ways that the role gets established.
Well, Martha obviously started it, and as Anita said, George Washington realized that he could not do this alone because he was both the head of state and the head of government. And the head of state part was going to be incredibly crucial, that soft diplomacy. When foreign governments came, we had to establish ourselves. We were already beginning to have divisions, and so that was an important role. And Martha had that experience. And one of the things Martha brought to this role was a vast amount of experience with George through the Revolutionary War. She was with him every winter. But also at Mount Vernon, they had what Richard Norton Smith, who we were talking about earlier, just said that in his biography of Washington, said that Washington described Mount Vernon as a well-appointed tavern, essentially, because they would have hundreds of visitors every year. You know, this was brewing, the revolution was brewing, and he was one of the key people. And so people were there, and she was used to that hostess role and to the importance of listening and getting people together. So when she arrived about a month after he was inaugurated on the New Jersey shore, went over to New York, our first capital, with him, they already had a list of assignments for her, because even his cabinet knew that he couldn't be dealing with all of these head of state issues. So it's been a two-person job from the beginning. And what Martha established was the importance of that soft power, the importance of the diplomacy. She was at every dinner he hosted. She had receptions on Friday nights that they called levees, that anybody could come to because they were a republic. There was not a monarchy. They were approachable. Anybody who was dressed properly could show up for Martha's levees. But the other thing that she did we talk a lot in the book about the threads that go through this. And as Anita said, the hostess thread definitely is through every one of them. But Martha was committed to veterans. She was committed to the military because she had been with George. She had knitted socks. She had darned the clothes in the camps in the winter. And so she had a policy that any veteran who came to the president's house could come and see her. Her letters are full of examples of her aiding widows of veterans, of her doing things for veterans, of her even asking George to use his pardoning power for minor infractions that some of them had come to her for. And so this thread, once again, of our first ladies supporting the military goes back to Martha. And that was really something that we see throughout, whether it's wartime or peacetime. It's been a real key role for our first lady. So those are a couple things. But Martha's Southern background really had a lot of influence on how she fulfilled a lot of that.
And I will go to Abigail. And I want you to know tonight I'm somewhat channeling Abigail, because Abigail liked to wear lace and she liked to wear pearls. So I thought it would be fun to sort of channel a first lady I admire so much. Abigail was came from a very different background from Martha, who came from a very wealthy Virginia Southern background. Abigail's father was a congregational minister. Interestingly enough, and I just found this out, he had several slaves. So Abigail did grow up with a few slaves. And her mother was from a very eminent Massachusetts family, the Quincy family. Her grandfather, Abigail's grandfather, had one of the largest libraries in Massachusetts. And Abigail was, from a very early age, encouraged to read, encouraged to learn. And it was a very educational environment, although she wasn't formally educated. Abigail meets John, and I like this story, so I'm going to read the quote. She meets John Adams when she was 11, and she was 15, he was 8 years older. And the first meeting was not a good one. He wrote later that his impression of meeting Abigail was that she was not fond, not frank, and not candid. Now, 8 years later, they're married and create one of the most lasting marriages and unions, 50 years plus. But it is interesting to note that John was not impressed with Abigail in the beginning. Over the years of their marriage, they would have 6 children, and Abigail would run the house, educate the children, and John got more and more involved in politics. And so there's a constant between Martha and Abigail which is that they are alone a great deal of time. And Martha is managing Mount Vernon. You'd think that was the man's job. No, no, no. Martha was doing that. Abigail is taking care of the farm, also doing little side businesses to earn more money, educating the children, and very much communicating with John through letters and supportive of his increasing desire to break away from Great Britain. So it is quite amazing. Then in 1776, when he is at the Continental Congress, Abigail writes the letter that we took the name of our, part of that letter, we made the name of our book. And the quote is, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." So I read it partly to show you Abigail didn't mind giving her views. And John sort of, he joked about it to one of his friends. And it was really what Abigail was really writing about was coverture, which was the English law system that essentially didn't recognize the woman legally. She was recognized by her husband or her father, but she couldn't own or be an entity on her own. And then John is gone a lot. Abigail is probably one of the most traveled early first ladies because she goes to England and France with John. And then he becomes vice president for 8 years. And then she becomes first lady, and her sister called it a splendid misery. She was going to begin her splendid misery. Why? Because Abigail was very outspoken. And she writes to John that she's fearful that she's going to have to hold her tongue and that people are going to criticize them. And also remember that during George Washington's term, factionalism had started, and now you have the Federalists who believe in more centralized power and the Democratic Republicans who believe in a more agrarian society, and the French system, and the Federalists believe in the British system. And John was elected president in 1767, and he is the only Federalist president that has ever been elected. And Abigail was very much his partner, his political partner, and a great demonstration and documentation, which is precious for this nation, is that they wrote these letters, because she was only with John half of the time of First Lady. The other half, she was either sick or taking care of her sick daughter. And he would call her Portia. They would each call each other their dearest friend. And those letters document so much of the early founding of our nation and are right next door at the Massachusetts Historical Society and online for people to read. So they are wonderful documentation. Abigail was the key political advisor to John. She advised on everything. She advised on patronage. And Abigail, and you'll see this trend just as Martha supported the military, Abigail becomes the first sort of press officer for her husband. She writes letters to various friends and to ministers, and actually says she doesn't mind if they get published. And they're very defending John's policies and talking about how awful the Democratic Republicans are. The one thing that Abigail probably did not give John good advice on are the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it very easy to deport aliens and immigrants, and also they were aimed at the Democratic Republicans, and they made it easy to arrest anyone who was critical of a Federalist policy. Those were passed in a series of 4 acts, and Thomas Jefferson, who was the Democratic Republican at this time, you just elected, the top 2 votes got president and vice president. They weren't necessarily the same party, was so upset with those acts, he left and went back to Monticello. So, but Abigail did so many good things, and I won't move on because I know we have, and we'll come back, I'm sure.
We will for sure come back. Did you want to say anything more about the, like Dolly Madison, for example, and her role in?
Sure, I'll add a few words about Dolly Madison. For as outspoken, of course, and sometimes criticized as Abigail was, Dolly was the unifier, right? Her superpower was a bipartisan entertaining that really went unmatched for decades after her. And she had the opportunity, of course, to serve as a de facto First Lady for Thomas Jefferson, our 3rd president, because he was widowed and his daughter was with him for a short time living in the White House, but then went back home to Virginia. So, you know, Dolly had this opportunity over a long stretch to be the social hostess at the White House, and was, you know, well known for her wonderful parties, for the rum punch that she served to everyone that made everybody happy, for working the room and gathering, you know, valuable pieces of information that were very helpful, of course, to her husband, and gathering information from his critics too, which was really helpful. And, you know, she also was a very colorful personality. You know, she'd grown up as a Quaker, but when she married James Madison, she was disowned by the Quaker faith, and that was just fine with her, because that repressed sort of way that she had to dress and act was now thrown off, and her form of dress in the White House was one to be noticed. She always had the most colorful clothes, the lowest cut, which was scandalous for the other women in the room, and for the men probably too. You know, a big plume on her head so that everybody in the room could see where she was. And she was just beloved. And I think for President Madison, although he appreciated, of course, her skills, her social skills, and her entertaining skills, it was her political astuteness that he really valued most.
Interesting. You know, it occurs to me as I hear you talking about these first ladies, you know, when we think of presidential history, I mean, there can be no doubt that John Adams has lived then and now largely in the shadow of George Washington. I mean, that's just the reality. But is it not also true that I feel that Martha and some of the others have lived in the shadow of Abigail? That when you think about who really sets, and I'm not saying that Mrs. Washington didn't have a lot to do with what happened, what came after, but it just seems to me that when you ask most Americans who are some of the early first ladies, everybody knows Abigail Adams. What is it about her that made her impact so great then and now, and left that indelibly etched in our memories?
We've talked about that because, as Nancy said, she was only with him for 2 years of the 4. And
Incredible. She
didn't do as much as Martha really did in 8 years, because she basically was with Martha by her side through all of those levees, and went with her to visit other women. And so there was an exchange of letters. She basically asked Martha for advice, and she did everything from on the hostess perspective. But where she was different, and where I think she gets the notoriety, is that letter.
Yeah.
That is what everyone knows her for, and it was in 1776. It wasn't when she was First Lady. Plus her outspokenness, her activity. She was called Mrs. President Adams. We didn't use the term First Lady. It really didn't gain cachet till the end of the 19th century. Martha was Lady Washington. She was Mrs. Adams, and her detractors called her Mrs. President Adams. And that's part of why she was very active, especially for a woman. And I think those things really had a lot to do with it. And the letters. She left that trove of letters, and Martha and George, Martha burned every letter between the two of them. So we don't have that letter history between the two of them about what was going on. And she was very circumspect. There's a book about 4 inches thick of Martha's letters, and many of them are during the White House years. But they were not talking about the politics. They weren't talking about her opinion of people. They were pretty much very socially oriented. But Abigail left that other type of
I didn't realize.
And if I could just say one other thing about Abigail, which is very important, is she was an abolitionist. And she so disliked slavery and made that very clear. She pushed for education for women. That was a big issue for her and a key issue at the time. And I think in Abigail's, why people so think of Abigail is she was far ahead of her times. In her letters, you see a woman who really thinks she has the right to be a political equal and talk on every societal topic. And Thomas Jefferson thought she was a brilliant, while they later had a very chilly relationship. They, for a while, wrote quite a bit. And he thought she was a great and very intelligent woman and had a lot of wisdom. I think that is part of it. I think that people also in the earlier ones think of Dolly. Dolly was very popular.
Right. She, Abigail, clearly had a great affinity for Jefferson as well. I mean, admired him greatly, and they did have a very warm relationship. You know, I had forgotten that Martha Washington had burned the letters, and I'm jumping out of chronology here, but I have to draw on my own experience and remind you of this letter that you know, that Harry Truman came home one day, and Bess Truman was taking all the letters that she had written to her husband, and she was throwing them in the fireplace and burning them. And Harry came in and he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm burning these letters." And he said, "Think of history." And she said, "I am."
And that is, in fact, a true story.
That's a very true story. Because their grandson found a little cache of letters that Bess had overlooked and proceeded, of course, like all good grandchildren would, to publish them. But nevertheless, we don't have nearly as much from her as we would, and the same with George and Martha. I'd forgotten that. You know, another reason I think Abigail stands out is their marriage. I mean, I think those letters, those truly love letters, their whole lives, and their letters were even at times a little racy. I mean, they had a very healthy relationship, and they weren't afraid to even sort of talk about that in their letters.
But that would be true of Dolly and
James. Yeah.
They had a union of the mind, and he writes her very racy things too. I think what part of it is with George and Martha, they weren't committed to paper.
Right.
The way James and Dolly and Abigail and John were.
Even though they were apart, I mean, we have no idea how much they wrote to one another.
Right.
There are 3 letters that survived, and they fell behind a drawer in a desk. And it's been just within the last 30, 40 years when they were doing renovations of that desk that those letters were discovered. And one of them was the letter he wrote to her when he had accepted the commission to head the Continental Army. And it was basically an apology, saying, "I'm now going to be away from you. I'm going to be away from our home, but I have to do this for the country." And then there were just a couple other letters, you know, and one of them he asked her to join him in Cambridge, where in 1775, December, where the troops were gathering and he was beginning to form the army. And she did. She went from her safe little home. So that was some insight into their devotion to one another, too. But unfortunately, we don't know what they ever said to one another in those letters.
Kurt, I'm going to actually add one thing, a letter that does exist, although we don't have it here in the United States, it's in France, that Martha Washington had written a letter to the Marquis de Lafayette detailing in very specific detail the funeral of George Washington. She had written to him and sent the letter to France, and this was on a trip that I had with Mrs. Bush when she was First Lady, and we went to the home, Chateau de Lagrange, the home of the Marquis de Lafayette, which interestingly enough, he had collected seeds from every tree of every state in the Union that he had visited on his last visit to the United States, and they were all planted at this home outside of Paris. Is remarkable. But backing up to this letter of Martha Washington that she had written all about the funeral and had included in the letter a lock of George Washington's hair. And so it exists at Chateau de Lagrange. Mrs. Bush and I look at it, we said, we shouldn't be touching this. This is like this most precious, artifact of our nation's first president. And when we got back to Washington, Mrs. Bush had called the Librarian of Congress and said, I think you need to find funds to digitize some of the letters and things that were at this at the home in Paris. But it was really remarkable to sort of see her handwriting, and she didn't have great spelling.
No,
bad
terrible
spelling.
speller.
Very bad spelling.
In fact, she would often dictate the letters she wanted to write, have someone write them with the correct spelling, then she would copy them into her own hand.
Interesting.
And I think it is a little bit misleading I think all three marriages were really, really close. Dolly and James were not apart the way Martha and George and Abigail and John were. They were only apart, I think the longest was for 3 weeks. So they don't have a documentation that the way the Abigail and John does. It is amazing for our nation that these first 3 marriages were so close and so helpful.
And that's interesting to think about because, they did spend, all of these couples spent, well, with maybe the exception of the Madisons, but certainly the Washingtons and the Adams spent a lot of time apart. And of course, the blessing to history is that we get this great correspondence. But, that they sacrificed, I think the Adams, all told, were apart 11 years of their marriage. And, for sometimes years on end at a time as he was abroad. And in the case of John and Abigail, I think you can say, the old adage, absence makes the heart grow fonder. They never lost their affection. It was hard to be apart. Abigail complained about it at times. So did he in some ways, but it was difficult. But they nevertheless never lost sight of their union, of their family, of their higher purpose, and certainly their dedication to public service. John Quincy and Louisa Catherine, maybe not so much. It seems to me that their absences and their marriage was much more troubled in some ways, and yet I'm fond of saying, and I would love to be corrected or understand this better, I think but for Louisa Catherine, there would have been no President John Quincy Adams.
Oh,
I think that's true of a lot of them.
Yeah.
She understood campaigning, and she understood what needed to be done, and he was so bookish and aloof and intellectual and just not really a relatable kind of guy, and I think that she softened that and is that right?
No, that's absolutely right. In fact, I highly recommend Louisa Thomas's biography. It's called Louisa, easy to find, 2 Louisas, Louisa by Louisa Thomas. Excellent
It's a great biography.
It's a great
really
biography.
great biography.
And, talk about the difference with that marriage. Is that Louisa even said, she kept a lot of diaries, both she and John Quincy kept diaries too, and she said it was not love at first sight. And she said, in fact, she said, I'm not sure it was love at all. But, she also said, but we had something that over time maybe was better. And this was a type of partnership. And I agree, he would not have been president without her, because during the period in which he was Secretary of State and they were in Washington, she had teas, weekly teas, and she would invite key members of Congress, she would invite members of the press, they would have big balls, and they eventually bought Dolly Madison's house. So you had the spirit of Dolly Madison, with Louisa, and Louisa was often compared to Dolly in the way that she did do the bipartisanship in very similar ways within the same house. And Louisa was doing all of this as a campaign strategy for him to become president. He wanted to be president, but because of his personality, he wasn't outgoing. And she also went to Congress. This is one of the things the women did that, we tend to think that they weren't as politically involved because they couldn't vote. They were supposed to not discuss politics. But most of these women, Dolly would go up to the Hill and would sit in. In fact, after Madison died and she moved back to Washington, they had a seat for her in the House of Representatives, an honorary member seat. And so Louisa would go to hear debates. And Louisa was walking through the halls of Congress. So she knew that the personal relationships were going to be very important. And if you recall, John Quincy became president, the only one by a vote of the House of Representatives. Because Andrew Jackson had won both the popular vote and the electoral vote, but he didn't have enough electoral votes to win. So the Electoral College didn't resolve it, and the next step is it goes to the House. And so much of what Louisa did during those 8 years that they were in Washington during the Madison administration laid the groundwork for some of those members of Congress to vote for John Quincy.
Yeah.
And so I do think, she was really key.
First lobbyist?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she really was.
Yeah.
And first campaigner.
Yeah,
First campaigner,
absolutely.
yeah.
I think it's interesting too, she wrote some different pieces that have survived, and one of them, her memoir, she starts late in life, and you get the sense that she's kind of in and out of a cycle of depression at times. But she writes her memoir. Now, get a load of this zippy title. I mean, you want to pick this up and read it this weekend. Adventures of a Nobody.
So sad.
Very sad.
Yeah.
It is.
So
It is
sad.
sad. But before you sort of weigh in on whether, I mean, of course,
Yeah.
I want to know what your thoughts on that. But when I think of that, especially in light of anticipating this program, I thought, can you imagine Nancy Reagan or Hillary Clinton writing anything by that kind of a title? I mean, to be so sort of denigrating and almost despair.
And she wrote it, she began writing it, it was called Reflections on My Life, and then the subtitle was Adventures of a Nobody. Because she had an incredibly adventurous life.
Very much so.
When he was in Europe and she's, going by herself from St. Petersburg to then join him later. And I mean, just the incredible adventures they had. But at the point she started it, it was when he was president. And she felt once he became president and he had the goal that he had set out, he forgot about her. He was totally distant. He did not tell her what was going on. They're occupying the same space. And she's not a part of this. Nobody wants her to do much of anything. She still continues to host very nice events and is once again complimented and compared to Dolly when she's first lady. But she was also incredibly ill.
Yeah.
Right.
And if you stop and think about how ill she was, she had had 15 pregnancies. And 11 of them ended in miscarriage. And she would have a miscarriage and John Quincy would haul her off someplace else or she'd be pregnant. And they had 4 children who were born live births and their one daughter died in Russia and they had to leave that child buried in Russia.
Right.
So she's physically not well. And then she's being ignored by her husband, and nobody really wants her opinion anymore. And she's being criticized for being too regal and being criticized for foreign-born. And in fact, in his re-election campaign, she and Rachel Jackson became big issues. We think things get ugly now, but Rachel Jackson was accused of being a bigamist because she didn't realize that her ex-husband hadn't really finished their divorce because women could not sue for divorce, only men could, and he didn't ever file the papers. And she married Jackson, and so they're accusing her of being a bigamist. And then, the Jackson people are accusing Louisa of being a foreign-born and went after her father, and it got really ugly. And so there was a lot Louisa was despondent about. Her children had issues. And so she started writing this at probably one of the lowest points in her life, when she got him where he needed to be, and then basically ignores her.
That's really sad.
Yeah, no, it is a kind of tragic story in a lot of ways, and yet she had this very exciting life. And so, someone's asked a question here about her being the first foreign-born. Mrs. Trump is the second first lady that we've had that was not born in the United States, but Louisa Catherine was the first. And you mentioned she's born in England. Her father is American, but her mother is English.
Right.
But she grows up in the court.
Yes.
I mean, in the setting of
Very cultured. Very
regal,
cultured.
you know, the pomp and the ceremony and things. So she's a very easy target for the more austere sort of Republican values of the almost frontier by comparison, America. That
She was worldly and diplomatic.
Very
and
much.
well-traveled and
The clothes,
very
the
different.
refinements, all
But-
of that.
And Abigail, I think, at first, when she met her for the first time, did not like
didn't
that.
go
Thought
well.
she was spoiled, and thought she was spoiled, and you know, certainly I grew up in New England too, so I could say this kind of the more puritanical, you know, view of things. That had to be very hard for her to earn that acceptance, and then to leave two of her sons, right, with the Adams, and was away from them for 8 years.
Yeah,
and I think regretted that her whole life.
She was apart from her children.
Well, you know, one other thing we need to mention is she's marrying John. Her father was quite a wealthy businessman, except right before she marries John Quincy, his business goes in the tank. No dowry, nothing.
Right.
So she's very embarrassed about that. And I think that on John Quincy's part, he thought he was getting more of a social, moneyed woman. And then Abigail is somewhat resentful of that image. It just was not a marriage made in heaven.
But John Adams loved her from the start.
Yeah.
They had a very, very close relationship. And one of the things that Louisa did do that I think, and we write about this in the book, is, as you know, John Adams and Jefferson died on the same day, 4th of July. And they had gotten a letter that John Adams was ill, and John Quincy took off for Quincy and left Louisa there at the White House. And then Louisa gets the letter before John Quincy actually gets to his father that John has already died. So John Quincy doesn't get there to be with his father before he dies. And then she gets the word that Jefferson has died on the same day, and she's left to figure out how to do the mourning for the country. We've lost 2 former presidents on the same day. And so here she is, and you can't pick up the cell phone and call John Quincy and say, how do you want me to handle this? And so she has to go lead the country through the mourning. And she did it quite remarkably well. And so that was the point at which she really rose to the occasion, and I think was really important. And one other little tidbit with her, she did take a page out of Abigail's book, and that was to write an anonymous letter to an editor. During this contentious campaign where they were attacking her personally, she wrote an anonymous letter, but it wasn't very well veiled because everybody figured out she'd written it, defending herself, defending her father, defending her husband. So she was really trying to do what Abigail had done much more skillfully, and it really backfired on her. So like I said, she just had a lot to be unhappy about.
Yeah. Let's come forward a little bit and talk about the role of First Lady as it begins to change and develop. We've sort of established this early several administrations and the role, and really largely just personality-based. I mean, you have someone like Abigail Adams, you have someone like Dolly Madison who bring a kind of gravitas to it just by virtue of who they are and just by how they're born. But what can you say about the evolution of the office and how some of the things become a little more formalized over time?
Well, the first lady to actually hire a professional staff position is Edith Roosevelt. So this is 1901, and She moves into the White House with 5 rambunctious children and then a stepdaughter, you know, Teddy Roosevelt's daughter from his first wife who had died. And she's moving into a house that is still, at this point, office and residence. And with this big family, this really was not that easy to manage. And then to have all the social obligations that were required out of the First Lady and out of the White House. And also this insatiable interest by the public and the press on all these children. And so she had to manage this, and she prevailed upon her husband to have the first federally paid position in the First Lady's, for the First Lady, and it was a social secretary who could manage the social obligations, but also help to feed some of the information to the press. So that's a turning point in the First Lady. There was not really an office of the First Lady. But you know, Mrs. Roosevelt also presided over the design and the construction, if you will, of the big changes to the White House, which was the creation and the building of an executive wing, which we now call the West Wing, where the president's office is, so that the White House itself was just residence. And so that's a turning point, obviously, in history. And then coming further along, Mrs. Johnson was sort of the first to hire a professional press secretary to her office, a professional journalist, into the position. Of course, she was quite active, and Nancy, of course, will talk a lot about Lady Bird, I'm sure, tonight. But that was, again, a further professionalization of the office. But the big change and the structure that we still have now that governs the Office of First Lady did not happen until 1978 under Rosalind Carter. This is the first established a budget for the Office of the First Lady. To this day, the positions in a First Lady's office are considered staff of the President assigned to the First Lady because the First Lady is not the elected official. But that structure that Mrs. Carter put in place that we still use now, the first projects and policy director, precursor to a chief of staff. She also had an issue that the President handed to her, the Mental Health Commission. But it really starts to change the way we view the First Lady's office. And she also was the first Lady to put her office in the East Wing, which is where the First Lady's office is today. That wing of the White House was built during World War II and the FDR administration as the staff was growing. A White House staff was growing. So the First Lady, Mrs. Carter, put her office in the East Wing to be with her staff, rather than previous First Ladies really worked out of their dressing rooms in the residence. And many First Ladies didn't have staff. Lou Hoover had three staff that she paid for personally out of her pocket. So that's an inflection point in the Office of First Lady, the professionalization of the staff. And of course, it's sort of ballooned over time. It's pretty small right now. Mrs. Trump doesn't have a very large staff and has said, publicly that she won't have a large staff. But that was definitely one point of change.
And then on the evolution of the role, you start with Lou Henry Hoover doing the first radio public address. You have Eleanor Roosevelt, who just breaks the whole model and becomes the activist First Lady.
Right.
And it's hard for me to tell you what projects Eleanor focused on because it was everything. It was race. It was promoting national youth administration programs. It was human rights. It was rights for women. It was being Roosevelt's eyes and ears. It was supporting the military. It was going on military trips. And she does the first woman's press conference. Roosevelt didn't really want Eleanor to be that active in the beginning, okay? And she had, after she found out he had an affair, they had crafted lives, and Eleanor had crafted a very independent life in New York politics and in teaching. And she didn't want to give all of this up. And she told her friend that while she was happy when Roosevelt got elected, it was one of the unhappiest times in her life. So, but she is allowed to give a press conference 3 days later. And she's told by Roosevelt's aide, you know, don't talk about anything other than domestic things and going on. And of course, Eleanor, that's like a red towel in front of a bull, you know. Eleanor sits down, she has a press conference with all women press reporters because they couldn't get employed that much in Washington. And she immediately begins talking on substantive issues. And that was sort of the blossoming of Eleanor. She does her My Day column, she does everything. And I think that FDR developed a feeling that he would let the missus do all these liberal things, and if people complained, he would say, well, I can't control the missus, you know, so she gave him some plausible deniability. Then you flash forward to Mrs. Kennedy, who focused on White House restoration, much against John Kennedy and the Kennedy men's staff. They did not want her to do that because they felt it only showed her luxurious background. And when she got the Emmy for her White House tour, then they became quite appreciative of her efforts. And then you have Lady Bird, as Anita said, who is the first lady who professionalizes the press function, also prioritizes various projects, beautification, the environment. She had to call it beautification because in 1964 she wanted to call it environment, and the staff of Johnson said that was too challenging a word. So she called it beautification, but I knew Mrs. Johnson, she hated the word beautification. I mean, she didn't hate beautification, it wasn't what she was doing. And then early childhood development, civil rights, then you go to Betty Ford, who gets cancer, and we did a conference in April of this last year at the Ford Museum, and it was really interesting to hear the oncologist date breast cancer research before Betty Ford and after Betty Ford. I thought that was just fascinating. Yeah. She made such a change in breast cancer treatment, ERA, then Rosalynn, who decides she will be head of the Mental Health Commission when Jimmy's elected. And then she goes home, and this is Rosalynn telling the story, and she tells the press she's going to be head of the Mental Health Commission, and then she laughs, and she says, I went home and told Jimmy he was going to appoint me head of the Mental Health Commission.
Yeah, Nancy, one person you left out, and I think this is a really important piece, is Pat Nixon.
I'm sorry, I should not have left Pat.
That's okay, because she took another level, and that was the global level.
Yes.
Right.
And diplomacy. People don't realize this, but to this day, she is the only First Lady who ever spoke before foreign parliaments, 2 of them, representing her husband's administration. Had not been done before, had not been done after. She went to, 70-some countries?
81.
81. And until Hillary Clinton, no one else had ever done that. And she went as an emissary for her husband. When there was this major earthquake in Peru, at the time, we had horrible relations with Peru, just hardly any communication. And there was this devastating earthquake, and we were going to send aid down, and she asked if she could take it. So she goes down, and in our book, we have a photo of her in her high heels in her business suit, climbing over rubble with the First Lady of Peru kind of following behind her. And she's talking to people, and she's gone to all these places, and she's finding out what they need and then communicating that back. The president of Peru gives her a special award. The newspapers are singing her praises, and that began chipping away at the problems between our two countries. And so, this was a diplomacy going by themselves, not accompanying their husbands, but literally being a solo, independent spokesperson for their husband's administration.
All of these examples sort of point to something that the audience is anticipating a little bit and asking, looking at, for example, there's an interest among the crowd here about women's rights and sort of the role and the evolution of that. And, one person in the audience says that women's rights throughout history have generally tended to gain, and yet now, this person observes they seem to be in a downward trend. And what do you think about that in terms of how the first ladies? I mean, one person points out that in 1775 were women even allowed to speak in public. I mean, so we've had think about how far some things have come, and yet how you think about the role that Abigail played, and yet think about the guff that Mrs. Carter took for attending cabinet meetings, or that Hillary took for trying to do health care. I mean, those it was just seen as like too much. Almost 200 years after Abigail was doing a lot of those
That's
things.
actually one of the threads of our book, is looking at the evolution and the status of women over the course of history while these first ladies are serving in their role, going from not having any rights at all to slowly gaining rights and a voice in the public square and becoming political actors of their own, like Hillary Clinton running for office. But again, and it was 133 years from our founding until women had even the right to vote. I'm sure you want to add to what a...
That's a really interesting observation, because one of the things they say about first ladies is that they're mirrors of their times, but they also are leaders of their times. And some first ladies have been both, and some have been one or the other. And what you've seen, especially with women's rights, is that they tended to mirror more. And if they tried to get out of, where most people thought they should be, they were often criticized, as Abigail was. And so they had to figure out how to do a lot of this subtly. And Nancy mentioned that Lou Hoover was the first to give a radio address. She was the first lady. We're talking, in the 1929, to actually give a speech, a public speech. And the first women who started giving speeches in the 1830s, they threatened to burn the buildings down because it was an unnatural act, and the congregational ministers put out what they called a papal bull condemning public speaking for women, that it was an unnatural act, women should not tell men what to do, and that St. Paul told you to be quiet. And so this was actually, so first ladies were really hesitant, even after you began having the suffrage movement after the Civil War and women were speaking, to be the ones to do that and to speak on suffrage because it was a thorny issue for their husbands. And they were savvy enough to know that they shouldn't do it. So, Julia Grant, for example, was a good friend of Susan B. Anthony's, and Susan B. Anthony was at the White House with her occasionally, but she would not come out and support what Susan B. Anthony was doing because it would have hurt her husband. So they often had their hands tied. And recently, there is a lot more liberty for them to do some things. But Betty Ford, for example, had to install a privately paid for phone line in the White House when she was lobbying for the ERA. Because there were protesters across the street complaining that she was using taxpayer dollars to call state legislators, because the legislators have to approve. And so she put in a private line, and we have a picture in the book of her at her desk making her phone calls, and she has a "Do Not Tread on Me" flag on the front of her desk.
But
go ahead.
No, well, I was just going to say they're also conflicted. Eleanor wasn't into the suffrage movement until Franklin got into the, suffrage movement. Why? we speculate that these women were at such a high place in society. Some of them did not feel the need. And the suffrage movement was maybe more aggressive. And in Eleanor's case, she thought they might hurt women's rights rather than help. So there's a lot of, I just want to say there's a lot of dimensional reasons going on.
And I think we do chronicle that.
We do.
Pretty well.
I think we also we do chronicle in the book too, how difficult it was for some of these women, particularly in the modern era and the second wave of feminism. This was certainly the case for Pat Nixon, who was never really accepted by the women's movement at all. And here she was working behind the scenes and overtly, actually, to get more women into the federal government at senior level positions, and not just at the desk, but in leadership positions. And I never really given credit for her advocacy there. And a lot, these are examples too of sometimes the unpopularity of the husband spills over on the spouse.
Well, and when we were talking, and we've done lots of programs, but things come up. When Diana was talking about Louisa and how John Quincy, when he became president, with Louisa's help, froze Louisa out. It's not totally dissimilar. Pat Nixon campaigned totally for Richard Nixon, killed herself.
Every campaign.
And then she becomes First Lady, and increasingly Nixon's staff, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, cut her out, shut her out. She comes back from one of the wonderful trips Diana's talking about. She gets a great report. And their instinct instead is to give her less, not give her more. So I saw, when you were talking about it, it just sounded a little, and
It's a good comparison.
Pat Nixon, while she did so much, I mean, for her coming from a poor family to have to leave the presidency with Richard Nixon resigning and her having so much integrity must have broken her heart. So I saw the tragedy somewhat similar.
No, that is an interesting comparison.
So just a couple more audience questions here. I think this is an interesting one, and maybe this is for you, Anita. Can you speak to the relationships between first ladies and second spouses? What is that relationship between what we would call the first and second lady?
Yes. It's never easy because it's a very difficult position for the second lady to not overshadow or overstep her bounds with the first lady. And so you have to wait sometimes and see what the first lady is going to be known for, what initiative she's taking on, where she's going to be active, before you could really break out on your own. Now, some first ladies and second ladies had a beautiful relationship, and that is certainly Pat Nixon and Mamie Eisenhower. Wonderful relationship, and Mamie relied on Pat Nixon a lot, and even President Eisenhower relied on Mrs. Nixon, and on trips that he would send Richard Nixon as vice president to travel, he would say to him, take Pat with you, because she was so good in representing our country abroad. And now they ended up marrying into each other's families, right? The Eisenhowers and the Nixons, so it went to the personal. But it can be a difficult relationship. I know for Mrs. Reagan and Mrs. Bush, Barbara Bush, it wasn't easy at all. They, maintained as cordial and respectful publicly a relationship as they could. But I think it is always a question for the second lady to just, not to be invited in to do something, like the way Michelle Obama and Jill Biden worked on joining forces together. This was Mrs. Obama's initiative, yet it was Jill Biden who was a military spouse, and they were a military family. I mean, she, had a son in the military, so she could understand it in a way that Mrs. Obama couldn't. So that was a great partnership over an issue together, and they traveled a lot with each other. But you really have to take the lead from the First Lady. It works out better that way, I would just say.
Well, and I would give one more example.
Yeah.
I think that the public's perception of the relationship between Jackie Kennedy and Lady Bird Johnson is not correct. Jackie Kennedy used Lyndon and Lady Bird a lot to do her functions, and Jackie actually asked Mrs. Johnson, and the only documentation that Anita and Diana and I can find, on November 26, 1963, she had Mrs. Johnson over to tea at the White House when Mrs. Johnson was still living at the Elms, and asked her to carry on and to make permanent her White House restoration efforts. And Mrs. Johnson told me in an interview I did with her, she said, "Nancy, I was so scared of that area. That was not my expertise. I would rather deal with businessmen or communications specialists or whatever." But she said, dealing with Henry DuPont and knowing the art, I was really scared, but she did it. She did it very successfully, and President Johnson made the Committee for the Preservation of the White House a permanent thing. Then Mrs. Jackie writes Mrs. Johnson letters that are just effusive. So there are, relationships, but as Anita said, you have to be brought in.
Yeah.
Lady Bird was asked to campaign for Jackie when she was pregnant, and she did such a good job in Texas and the southern states that Robert Kennedy said he thought she helped John Kennedy win the election. And since Robert Kennedy hated the Johnsons, that was high praise.
High praise.
Absolutely. What you've mentioned, you mentioned Mrs. Biden, and we've mentioned Mrs. Trump in passing. Someone in the audience is wondering if these two most recent First Ladies have taken a different path. I mean, are they changing the role of First Lady? In what ways do you observe that's happening?
I'll just mention one word on this. I'll let my colleagues respond too. But this is another thing we talk about in the book. This position is constantly evolving, and it's defined by the occupant.
Right.
And the position adapts to each occupant. And sometimes the occupant adapts to the position. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that it's different, because it has the ability to do that. Again, there's not a statutory requirement for this position. Are some of the norms and traditions that we've gotten used to were disrupted in the last couple of inaugurations and transitions? I mean, the visits up in the White House between an outgoing First Lady and an incoming First Lady, I think as Americans we need to see that kind of embrace of each other, particularly when a campaign has been very contentious and has been very divisive. And I hope we get back to that. But again, I think we have to give everybody the grace to do the job in the way that they feel is right for them and is authentic to them.
Yeah, one of the other points we make in the book is that the First Lady brings her own life experiences to the position, and they all have had very different life stories. And so some of them are far more comfortable doing certain things than others are. Like Jackie did not like to give speeches. So Lady Bird gave, 100 and some speeches on Jackie's behalf when Lady Bird was second lady. You won't see that happen very often, but she also had young children, and that's where she wanted to give her attention. So, I agree with Anita. They have the flexibility to interpret this role any way they want, and their own backgrounds are part of the way that they begin developing what their issues are, what they're comfortable with, what they aren't comfortable with. And I think that's important. If there was a big change with the two recent First Ladies, it would be Jill Biden having a paid job outside the White House. I mean, that was a major
pushed
shift.
The position for her too.
Moved it. And we were getting a lot of questions during the campaign when there was a potential for a first gentleman of, will it be any different? And basically what we all said was, no, draw on their own experiences. They will be there mainly to support the president in what the president considers important. But I think what Jill Biden did by working will make it easier to have a first gentleman. Because I think most people will expect a first gentleman to have a job. And if you look at women governors, I'm from a state on our third woman governor right now. And we've certainly had two who went ahead and kept working and did what they wanted to do, and nobody expected a lot. So I think people will probably expect a first gentleman to work. And Doug Hemhoff worked as second gentleman. And so I think she helped pave the way for that. But that was a huge transition. And if you want to talk about being a mirror of our times, that was reflective of, all of us sitting here and probably most of you sitting out there, of where you have domestic responsibilities at your home and you have a professional career. And Jill Biden showed you can do both of those as First Lady.
Well, and I do want to say on Melania, she's very interesting because in the first term, she actually did come out, one of the few first ladies I can think of, and disagreed in public with her husband. He says not to wear masks for COVID. She goes on PBS, I think.
She did a public service announcement.
And says, please wear masks.
And social distance.
And social distance. And she, during the Stormy Daniels situation, Rudy Giuliani says that he's met with her and she's very supportive of the president. She has her office come out the next day and says she has not met with Rudy Giuliani.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm just giving you a few examples,
right, exactly.
But, and the other thing is, there was some similarity, and I know this will shock people, between Michelle Obama and Melania Trump, because Michelle Obama was thinking of not coming up till Sasha and Malia finished their school year, and she finally decided she would come up. Melania decided she would stay until Barron finished it. So, there's a book out by the Bush Institute which says, it's on all first ladies, not just U.S. first ladies, but the title is
Roll Without a Rule Book.
Roll Without a Rule Book. And I think that is so true.
Sums up your question.
There have been a couple questions, and I think this is interesting from the audience, about different first ladies, and especially in times of crisis. You think about, this one is about President Wilson, and of course he has a stroke. He's in pretty bad shape and not really, it was different than it is now in terms of the media being aware.
Sure.
But was Mrs. Wilson the first woman president?
I think you could say that.
I think so.
It was an extraordinary overreach of power, without a doubt.
Yeah.
And there is a book I highly recommend, I think we all do, by Rebecca Roberts, called Untold Power. It came out about 2 years ago on Edith Wilson. And what it shows is even when they were courting, she was overstepping. He was writing these passionate love letters to her, and she's responding with, what can you tell me about this tariff act or something? And so he was sending documents to her. Classified documents to her when they were courting, so she would know what was going on. She decoded the messages during World War I. That's who he trusted to do it. And there were complaints about her overreach from the very beginning. And so when she did this, it had just been kind of part of what the relationship was.
But you think about it, 17 months. The vice president saw President Wilson one time, and the cabinet didn't see him at all for 17 months. You just cannot imagine that happening in today's day.
Of course, there was no 25th Amendment.
25th Amendment.
Yeah. Right.
She was cited in part of the
That's
argument.
part of the reason,
Exactly.
part of the reason to
argument
need the
for
amendment.
it.
Anita, I wanted to ask you something about a program I did a few years ago with some chefs and stewards from the White House, and their experience. And people who talk about their opportunity to serve the first family, they get really emotional even about it. I mean, it's a big deal in their mind and their life to be able to say that they've served these families. And I remember there was one young lady who was a she seemed young at the time, so she must have been really young, maybe just a young military aide or something, and she was aboard Air Force One, and it was on 9/11. And Bush was leaving Florida, and he probably didn't know where they were going because they were just head to the sky and just discern what's going on.
Right.
And this young woman knew that Mr. Bush liked a certain kind of chocolate chip cookie. And they had those on board, so she heats these up or makes them or whatever they do in the plane. And she took those in to the president. And you know Mr. Bush, I'm sure it was a very gracious exchange.
I appreciate it.
But it meant so much to her to be able to see this man with the weight of the world on his shoulders and to be able to sort of give him just some little comfort, some little pleasure in that moment, just to say, hey, we're here with you. We care about you. And it made me think, we've seen the footage. I know where Mr. Bush was. I know what he was doing. Where was Mrs. Bush on 9/11, and how did she respond to that kind of tragedy for the nation?
Well, on that morning, Mrs. Bush was doing something she was really nervous about going to do, and this was to do a congressional briefing on early childhood education on a summit that she had just held in the previous summer, the summer of 2001, on early childhood cognitive development. It was all part of what the message of the day was supposed to be for 9/11. The president was out in Sarasota, Florida, to talk about No Child Left Behind and education. Mrs. Bush was going to be on the Hill doing a briefing on education and her role in education reform. And this is really how the White House works every day. You try and be on the same page and the same message that is coordinated, certainly amongst the principals. And so you could do a lot of planning for that, and she was prepared, and she was traveling up there to Capitol Hill with the domestic policy advisor, Margaret Spellings, and arrived. When she left the White House, one of her agents had told her that an aircraft had hit one of the World Trade Center towers, and of course, like everybody, they didn't have all the full information and thought it was, an errant plane and an accident. By the time she gets up to the Capitol, the second plane had hit the second tower. And what was interesting about that morning was, so first of all, let me just go back and say, all the preparation you could do in the world, even in the White House, nothing could ever prepare you for something like that, right? For a terrorist attack on the nation. And so urgent priorities always have to overtake the important. So Mrs. Bush was being hosted by the senator from Massachusetts, Ted Kennedy. He was chair of the Education Committee. He's the one who invited Mrs. Bush to come up and give this congressional testimony. So obviously the hearing was postponed. There was an impromptu press availability in the Senate hearing room with Senator Kennedy, with Mrs. Bush, and with the ranking member of the committee, Senator Judd Gregg of New Hampshire. And she was asked a question by one of the members of the press from USA Today, Mrs. Bush, what do we say to the families and children in the country? And no one, again, she just drew from her own deep inner reserves and said, to tell them they are safe and to turn off the television. And, she waited for President Bush to speak first before she went out there to say anything, and he did an impromptu, press availability at the school in Sarasota before he was sent to 3 different Air Force bases, around the country. But, their lives, of course, transformed immediately, like our nation did, and went from, being an education and domestic-focused president and First Lady to being wartime President and First Lady. And I think, what's interesting, you mentioned how the military steward made those cookies for the president, just to give one little ounce of comfort to him. For Mrs. Bush, she says in her memoir, she needed to hear the sound of her mother's voice to feel some comfort. And when she got to an undisclosed location where she was evacuated to, and once she had talked to the president and had reached her daughters through the Secret Service. They were now in college. She called her mother, and that was her moment of comfort. But, you know, again, everything just changed immediately. And I was working in the White House then. I was in management and administration, so the operations end of the White House. And, you know, I had worked in the White House twice before. And when you work there, you feel safe. You're working in the most secure building in the world. How could anything happen to you there? But when you're told by Secret Service agents who have drawn their weapons to take off your shoes and run for your life, you do what you're told. And all the gates of the White House were opened, and everybody just exited. And actually, you know, when Mrs. Bush did come back to the White House later that afternoon, when we knew the president was coming back about 6 o'clock that night, and when her cars, you know, pulled in to the White House, what's out on the walkways are strollers from the tours that were there that morning, families that were coming in to see the White House. Then they were evacuated too, and all their belongings were just left behind.
Some of the biggest number of clicks or hits or whatever on the National Archives page was when they released the photos of the Bushes and the Cheneys in the Situation Room, all four of them.
Right.
Mrs. Bush and Mrs. Cheney there with the president and vice president.
That's right.
Looking over, you know, monitors and being briefed and being told they were both there, Mrs. Cheney and Mrs. Bush in the background. It was really quite compelling to see that and understand what a human moment that was for them. And I think that's what we sometimes forget. We see these people in textbooks.
Right.
We see them as these sort of two-dimensional people, but I love how you put it, that they draw from the reservoir of who they are.
You know, they're husbands and wives. And
they're real people.
And daughters. And
They are.
Yes,
their marriages
they
and their
draw from their
relationships.
deep inner reserves on how to respond.
I will say on that human element, in 1987, I interviewed Lady Bird, and I asked her about November 22nd, 1963. Okay, that is so many years later, and she starts talking and a tear goes down her eye. So it goes to what we're all saying. These are real people. It's not just in some textbook. You know, they lived through it, and and it changed her agenda just as 9/11 changed Laura Bush's agenda.
One last question for each of you. If you've studied all of the First Ladies from the beginning to the end, to where we are today, if you had to go back in time and say, which one of these individuals do you think has not gotten her due? Who do you think has been the most overlooked? And who do you think, if you could write an article or you know, write an additional chapter or a biography of, who do you think deserves a reconsideration?
Well, we talked a lot about Pat Nixon, so we gave her due, but I'll start with one. Bess Truman fascinates me. Bess Truman is overlooked and underappreciated. We've mentioned how she was, you know, certainly a great confidant to her husband, too. There probably wasn't a decision that Harry Truman made without her advice. And she had the family connections in the background that really helped to propel him in politics. She worked as a member of his staff in the Senate when he was senator from Missouri. She knew how things worked. She made relationships with other Senate spouses. And those relationships really came to bear when she became First Lady. And one of the most remarkable stories about her, of course, we all know the White House went through a major renovation during the Truman presidency. For 3.5 years, the Trumans had to move out and lived in Blair House because the White House was deemed uninhabitable and had to be completely rebuilt. And there were several proposals that were put in front of the Trumans and then ultimately had to be put in front of the Congress because the Congress had to fund it. And the least expensive of the proposals was to tear the whole building down and rebuild. The most expensive was to protect, maintain the facade, what we know of the north, the south, side of the White House. what we are emotionally connected to as Americans, and dig deep underneath and rebuild from way underground. Very expensive proposition. Well, the Congress, of course, what do you think they wanted to do? They wanted to tear the building down and restart and go the cheapest route. And it really was Bess Truman who used her lobbying knowledge, her skills of knowing how the Senate appropriations process worked, knew the members, knew the appropriators, knew the spouses. And basically her message to them was, if you do this, the American people will never forgive you. So when you see the white pictures of the White House, you think of Bess Truman and what she did to protect our beautiful, wonderful White House. We know what Jackie Kennedy did, of course, the historic preservation and the structure and the legacy that she put in place to have a private funding arm for the maintenance of the White House to keep it museum quality. That's the White House Historical Association, because Jackie Kennedy knew there would never be enough government money to maintain the White House in the way that it should, and she was right. And we give Mrs. Kennedy her due, but Bess Truman really underreported what she did to protect it.
I'll go with a 19th century First Lady, Sarah Polk.
Yep.
How many of you know anything about Sarah Polk or even had heard her name before? No. Powerful First Lady. Probably one of the most powerful First Ladies we had outside of probably Edith Wilson. She and Louisa had a lot in common in that they both took Dolly Madison as a kind of a role model for using social graces and bipartisanship. But this is another one where the background made a difference. She grew up in a political family. She was educated far better than any woman in the early 19th century. She went to a boarding school. She was from Tennessee, went to North Carolina for what essentially was a boarding school that would have been more like associate degree type work. She'd been tutored her whole life. Her parents were friends of Andrew Jackson's. So that connection helped her husband considerably. And when she met her husband, James Polk, those political connections were very important for him. And when he was elected to Congress, he was very distraught in this first part of his term because she was still back in Tennessee and he needed her with him. And she then got to know the women. It was like what Bess Truman did, use those connections. He eventually became Speaker of the House, and part of the reason he did was that she took the Dolly approach. Dolly mentored her in how to do bipartisanship because he was one of the leaders of his party. And so when he became president, she was doing a lot of the same types of things as Dolly Madison, but she wrote his speeches. She got up every day and read multiple newspapers and would summarize the newspapers for him. She pretty much controlled his calendar. If cabinet members wanted access, they pretty much had to go through her to get it. She decided his schedule, and she traveled with him outside of Washington and outside of DC, which was pretty much unheard of at the time. So a very, very powerful First Lady, but she did it behind the scenes. And she would always, just as Dolly had done, she would have these social events, and she'd test out some of his ideas. And they were pretty much hers also. And she would say, well, Mr. Polk thinks. And she was going to float something to some of these folks and then tell him kind of how it went. But when she left, she was very highly praised. And it was because she knew once again how to stay in her lane. And she was another one who didn't think women needed the right to vote. She was invited to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, and she didn't go. Because she had all the power she needed through her husband. Yeah.
Very good.
I would say misjudge Mary Lincoln. If you care about Abraham Lincoln, and most people do, and he rates as the highest president, he would not have been president without Mary Lincoln. Forget about her personality, forget that she was probably bipolar, forget that she was in deep depression, as was Lincoln when their son died. But when Lincoln ran for Senate twice and did not get it, she encouraged him. He wanted to go out to Oregon to become like a governor of Oregon, and Mary was very clear and told him, if you go to the West, you will be off the national stage. And I think you can be president someday. And he laughed. She brought him in, she made him, she refined him, she helped him think that he could be president, and she stood by him in a very difficult time as president. She never wavered in support of his position for the Union and in terms of the Civil War, even though she was from Kentucky and had relatives who were Confederate soldiers who were killed. So, do I think she was an angel? No. But I do think if in history you care about Abraham Lincoln, you've got to give Mary Lincoln some credit for his being there. The other thing I will say is, if we're somewhat wrapping up, is that all three of us would say these men married incredibly well.
They did. They were lucky.
Yeah. They were very lucky.
They were lucky. Thank you.
Most men do. So one final anecdote here. We are wrapping up. In the months before I came to the Adams Center, I was director of the Truman Library, and I had the privilege of giving Mrs. Biden a tour of the library. She was in Kansas City for an event, and we, through some connection, we were able to get her there for an hour. And as you know, whenever the First Lady goes anywhere, it's just like the President, the Secret Service is just all over the place. They ask us to shut the library down for half a day. They bring in these dogs and they sniff around the whole building. And of course, they always have a code word for the First Lady, a code name to kind of keep it on the down low. So imagine my surprise when the facility manager comes to me and says, they have a code word for Mrs. Biden. Oh, who is it? Taylor Swift. You know, I can imagine how many people would be descending on the library if they knew that we had Taylor Swift in the house, much more so than the First Lady herself. But anyway, ladies, whether you're First Ladies or a rock star, you have given us a fantastic performance tonight. Thank you so much. Anita McBride, Diana Carlin, Nancy Smith, thank you all so much. Thanks for being here. We'll see you again.